So, a reading from Amos chapter 8. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me, a basket of ripe fruit. What do you see, Amos? He asked. A basket of ripe fruit, I answered. Then the Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, the songs in the temple will turn to wailing. Many, many bodies flung everywhere. Silence. Hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be ended that we may market wheat, skimping on the measure, boosting the price, cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals, even selling the sweepings with the wheat. The Lord has sworn by himself, the pride of Jacob, I will never forget anything they have done. Will not the land tremble for this, and all who live in it mourn? The whole land will rise like the Nile. It will be stirred up and then sink like the river of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. The days are coming, declares the sovereign Lord, when I will send a famine through the land, not a famine of food or a thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. People will stagger from sea to sea and wander from north to east, searching for the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. In that day, the lovely young women and strong young men will faint because of their thirst. Those who swear by the sin of Samaria, who say, as surely as your God lives, Dan, or as surely as the God of Beersheba lives, they will fall, never to rise again. The judgment continues. This time, the illustration is a basket of fruit. Now, that might not mean too much to us, but to the hearers, it would have resonated. It would have reminded them of the words of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 16, verse 13, at the Feast of Booths. And that was a festival that celebrated the goodness of God throughout the year, and it looked forward to a future blessing. However, this time, there's going to be no future blessing. Look at verse 2. I will spare them no longer. God's patience has finally run out. Now, the basic charges against the people this time are injustice. Look at the slavery. False religion. And ultimately self-centeredness. A failure to recognise God. Because when we're self-centered, we don't see God. You know, they even want their church services to finish quickly so that they can get back out and go and make money and oppress the poor. God to them has become a hobby, irrelevant, boring. Remind you of anyone or anything? What's our attitude to the worship of God? Is it a hobby? Is it irrelevant? Is it boring? If the service is too long and the potatoes need turning down. And what does God say in verse 7? I will never forget anything they have done. God remembers. And actually, that should be a comfort to all who have received no justice in this life. God is a God of justice, and God is a God who never forgets. So when injustice, when evil is done to us, God sees, God notices, God never forgets, and judgment will come to those who have hurt him or his people. God is a God of justice. And do you see what happens on the day when judgment comes? Do you notice the people had gathered for a religious festival, verse 10. The earth was covered in darkness, verse 9. The ground splits or trembles, verse 8. A father mourns his son, verse 10. That sound familiar? Sound a bit like Good Friday, perhaps. That day when Jesus died to take our punishment and our judgment in our place. But God's judgment gets even worse, more serious. We're told there will be a famine of the word. No one will hear from God. And if you think back to chapter 2, verse 12, or maybe chapter 7, verses 12 to 13, that's exactly what the people of Israel wanted. They didn't want to hear from God. Verse 12, we read that the people don't know where to look for God. So they go looking for God elsewhere. They even go on a pilgrimage to Beersheba. But that's pointless, says Amos. And who are going to be the most vulnerable to this famine of the word? Verse 13, the young. Because if there's a famine of the word, a vacuum's created, which will be filled by other things. And the young, they try out new things. They search for new experiences. So what does this mean for us? Well, it means it's incredibly important that we have faithful preachers of the word in our churches. Does yours? I pray you don't suffer from a famine of the word. It means that if we know people who are faithful preachers of the word, then please support them and please pray for them. Because as we've seen through Elijah in Kings, now in Amos, Paul in Acts, it's a tough life. Please support them. And it also shows just how important it is that we have our Sunday schools, our youth groups, that we have really good Christian children and young people's workers in our churches, in our mission areas, however we define them. So important we have faithful ministers of God's word and we support them. So God, we hear again, is a God of judgment, a God whose patience runs out. He's a God who never forgets. He forgives, but doesn't forget. But he's a God who brings justice. And for those of us who've been on the wrong end of injustice, let's take comfort from that. Our God is a God of justice.